My sister flirted with every boyfriend I took home for Christmas. I've always believed that Christmas has a smell. For most families, it's cinnamon, pine needles, maybe a hint of nutmeg drifting from the kitchen. For mine, it's that plus something else. An undercurrent of tension so familiar I can almost taste it before I even pull into my parents' driveway. This year was no different. Snow crunched under the tires as my boyfriend, Ryan, and I pulled up to the house I grew up in. The windows glowed a warm yellow, wreath on the door, inflatable snowman leaning slightly to the right like it had one too many eggnogs. Everything screamed holiday cheer, yet my stomach tightened the closer we got. Ryan squeezed my hand gently. "Your family's excited to see you," he said, and his voice had that hopeful edge people get right before meeting loved ones they desperately want to impress. I smiled back, but it felt thin, stretched across a face already prepared for battle. He didn't know my family the way I did. Specifically, he didn't know my sister. The door opened before we even reached the steps, and there she was, Caroline, blonde curls bouncing, teeth painfully white, arms open wider than the Grand Canyon. I swear I could hear sleigh bells behind her even though the porch was dead quiet. "There she is," she sang out, completely ignoring me and zeroing straight onto Ryan. She hugged him first, her arms wrapped around him like he'd just returned from a 10-year deployment. He stiffened slightly, glancing at me over her shoulder, but she didn't notice or didn't care. When she finally turned to me, her hug was shorter, lighter, almost obligatory. "Hey, sis," she said, but her eyes flicked back to Ryan like her brain was already calculating how to position herself next to him at dinner. It was the same thing she did every year, though this time I wasn't brushing it off as Caroline being friendly. We walked inside, and the heat from the fireplace hit me immediately. The smell of cloves and roasted ham warmed the air, and my mom rushed over with a dish towel still in her hand. She greeted us with that soft, familiar excitement only moms have, but even she paused to give Ryan a second, slightly too approving look. Caroline was already on him again. She reached for his coat, pulling it off before he had a chance to respond. "Oh my gosh, you must be freezing," she said, brushing imaginary snowflakes off his shoulders. Her fingers lingered a second too long. My jaw tightened. Ryan laughed awkwardly. "I'm good, really. Long drive, though." He shot me a look that said, "Is this normal?" I gave him one back that said sadly, "Yes. There's always this strange moment when I bring someone new home. It's like watching a slow-motion replay of the same script I've seen every year since I was 16. Caroline plays the angelic hostess, dripping warmth and charisma, while simultaneously pushing me out of my own spotlight. I become the background character in my own life, standing near the Christmas tree with my coat still half on while she swoops in and claims center stage. My dad called from the living room, asking Ryan about his job before he even stepped out of the hallway. Caroline used that moment to loop her arm through his and lead him toward the sofa like a tour guide giving a VIP experience. I followed behind them, feeling like the third wheel on what was supposed to be my holiday visit. The living room looked the same as always, fire crackling, stockings hanging unevenly, a plate of cookies already missing half their contents. Every corner twinkled with lights. The warmth of it all should have calmed me, but instead I felt the familiar tension crawling up my spine. Caroline plopped down next to Ryan on the couch, just a little too close, tucking her legs under her in that casual but calculated way she does. She asked him questions rapid fire, where he grew up, how long he'd been in his career, what sports he played. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of interest that wasn't just family-level welcoming. It was something else, something I'd seen too many times before. Ryan answered politely, but I caught the subtle signs. Glancing my way for reassurance, shifting slightly away from her, drumming his fingers on his knee. The guy wasn't oblivious, at least. I sat down on his other side, grounding myself by the warmth of his arm against mine. Caroline didn't move. If anything, she leaned in closer. My mom passed around hot cocoa, and the rising steam fogged my glasses for a moment. That temporary blur felt almost peaceful, like the world softened just long enough for me to breathe. But when the fog cleared, Caroline's hand was on Ryan's arm again. Light, delicate, accidental. I didn't react. Not yet. I've learned over the years that reacting only fuels her. Instead, I wrapped both hands around my mug, letting the heat settle into my palms. This Christmas already felt different, heavier, sharper. Maybe it was because I cared deeply for Ryan, or maybe because I was tired of pretending, tired of being overshadowed, tired of walking into the same storm every year. As the fire cracked softly and laughter rose around me, I couldn't shake the strange awareness settling in my chest. Something about this Christmas felt like the beginning of something I couldn't yet name. From the moment we settled into the living room, I could feel Caroline sharpening her attention like a blade. It wasn't overt. Not yet. But it was enough to prick at the back of my neck every time she shifted closer to Ryan or tossed her hair in that practiced way she always used when she wanted eyes on her. She didn't have to look directly at me for me to feel it. The silent challenge, the unspoken question of whether I could hold on to anything without her trying to take it. Ryan tried his best to focus on me, asking about the Christmas puzzle I'd helped Mom finish last year, or making small jokes whenever my dad said something unintentionally funny. But Caroline had a way of slipping into every space like water through tiny cracks. If Ryan laughed at something I said, she laughed louder. If he leaned toward me while listening to Dad's story, she would find a reason to lean in too, pretending she couldn't hear, pretending she just needed to get closer. It was subtle, but the subtle things are sometimes the most infuriating. They're too small to call out without looking paranoid, but big enough to stir something messy inside you. I kept telling myself not to overthink it. It was only the first hour. Maybe she was just excited to meet him. Maybe she was trying too hard to be likable the way she often did. But every time I tried to let the thought dissolve, something else would happen that pulled the thread taut again. Like when Mom called us to the kitchen to help set up dinner. Ryan stood to follow me, but instead of walking behind me, Caroline cut in front and hooked her arm casually around his. Her laugh floated through the air, light and bright, as she said something about showing him where the silverware was kept. Something he absolutely didn't need a guided tour for. I watched them step through the doorway together, her head tilted up toward him. He didn't seem charmed, more confused than anything, but that didn't make the sight sting any less. The kitchen smelled like rosemary, butter, and my mom's famous rolls warming in the oven. Steam fogged the window over the sink, blurring the Christmas lights outside into soft, colorful blobs. Normally, the kitchen was my safe space during the holidays, cozy, loud, and full of familiar chaos. But this time, all I could see was Caroline leaning lightly against the counter, shoulders angled toward Ryan as she talked. I could tell by the way she spoke, too breathy, too animated, that she had switched into her holiday host performance mode. It was the same version of her that used to charm my teachers, grab the attention of every guy at school, and somehow make even my friends gravitate toward her without her trying. Ryan stood politely, one hand in his pocket, nodding as she spoke. He noticed me across the room and gave me a small, apologetic smile, like he knew this wasn't how things were supposed to go. I joined them at the counter, sliding between them under the guise of grabbing a dish towel. Caroline didn't move an inch. If anything, she shifted just enough to reclaim a sliver of space that forced me a tiny bit back. Mom chatted with Ryan about the traffic, the weather, and whether he liked strong or mild coffee in the mornings. All normal topics, except Caroline watched every exchange with an intensity that made my skin itch. She wasn't smiling sweetly anymore. She was studying him, measuring his reactions, waiting for openings. Later, while we arranged the plates on the dining table, Caroline started telling a story from our childhood. A story that conveniently made me look ridiculous. It was always something with her. This time, she recounted the Christmas I slipped on the icy porch steps and spilled hot cocoa all over myself. Everyone laughed, and I even forced a smile to keep things light. But she kept going, adding exaggerated details that made me sound clumsy, dramatic, and over the top. Ryan chuckled but glanced at me with a softness that told me he didn't believe half of what she was saying. Still, the humiliation prickled beneath my skin. I could practically feel the heat rising to my cheeks. Caroline noticed. She always notices. Her smile widened just enough for me to catch it. My dad walked into the room with the confidence of a man who'd had exactly 2 holiday cocktails and announced dinner was ready. As we all shuffled toward our seats, Caroline made sure to maneuver herself so she sat directly across from Ryan instead of anywhere near me. Strategic, subtle, predictable. During dinner, I caught her watching him between bites, eyes sparkling in that unmistakable interested way she used to reserve for boys she wanted to impress. Whenever he spoke, she leaned forward. Whenever he laughed, she tilted her head and smiled slowly, like she was savoring the sound. But the strangest part was how familiar it all felt, like an old script being performed with new actors. By the end of the meal, my chest felt tight, not with panic, but with a mix of irritation and resignation. I told myself again not to jump to conclusions, not to let old wounds decide how this Christmas would go. Still, it was impossible to ignore the tension under my skin, the way every instinct told me to be on alert. As I helped Mom carry dishes back into the kitchen, I looked over my shoulder and saw Caroline laughing at something Ryan said, her hand lightly brushing his forearm. I turned away quickly, swallowing the bitter taste rising in my throat. It was only the first evening, and already I felt myself slipping into that familiar holiday role. The observer, the outsider, the one quietly keeping score while everyone else pretended nothing was happening. And deep down, a small, quiet dread settled in my chest, whispering that this Christmas might test me more than any before. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs so clearly it almost hurts. At the time, though, I was young enough and naive enough to mistake Caroline's behavior for normal sisterly teasing. You grow up thinking siblings are supposed to annoy you, maybe compete a little, maybe borrow your clothes without asking. But there's a difference between being annoying and being undermined, and it took me years to recognize that line. The first time I noticed something was off, I was 14. I'd brought home a boy named Caleb, who wore too much cologne and thought skateboarding was a profession. We weren't serious. We weren't even really dating. But he was the first boy who ever held my hand, and in the hormonal chaos of early high school, that felt monumental. Caroline was 16 then, already blooming into the kind of girl boys tripped over themselves to impress. Pretty, confident, effortless in a way that made adults adore her and made me feel like a knockoff version of myself. The day I introduced Caleb to the family, she immediately took over the conversation, asking him what music he liked, complimenting his hoodie, leaning just a little too close when she laughed. I remember standing there holding 2 mugs of cocoa, feeling invisible in my own kitchen as the steam curled upward like little white ghosts. At the time, I convinced myself she was just being friendly. That word followed me for years, acting as a shield for every uneasy moment, every uncomfortable glance, every instance where a guy's attention drifted away from me and toward her. Everyone said Caroline was friendly. Everyone said I was imagining things. I believed them until it became impossible to. The older we got, the more polished her methods became. In high school, teachers loved her. My friends loved her too. Some a little too much. I lost 2 crushes to her before I even turned 17, and though she always apologized afterward, her apologies had a recycled quality to them, as if she kept them prepackaged for convenience. By the time I turned 18, I started noticing patterns. Whenever I brought someone around, Caroline turned into the most charming version of herself. She'd toss her hair, laugh like she just heard the funniest joke ever told, or tilt her head with that perfect mix of curiosity and flattery. She had a way of looking at boys that made them feel like they were the only person in the room, something I could never replicate no matter how hard I tried. Christmas was always the worst. Family dinners, warm lighting, movies playing softly in the background. It was the perfect environment for her to showcase her effortless magnetism. I'd bring a boyfriend or someone I liked, hoping maybe this year would be different, and without fail, she'd step into the picture like she was auditioning for a role I didn't know we were competing for. There was one year I'll never forget. I had a boyfriend named Josh. Sweet, quiet, someone who actually listened when I talked. He held my hand under the table during dinner, squeezing gently whenever the conversation made me nervous. I remember thinking we were solid. But then Caroline walked in wearing a red sweater that seemed intentionally chosen for effect. She sat across from Josh, crossed her legs slowly, and spent the entire evening asking him questions about his hobbies, his travel plans, whether he liked skiing. I felt my stomach twist when Josh's answers grew longer and his eyes drifted her way more often. 2 days after Christmas, he broke up with me. The reason he gave was vague. Something about needing to work on himself or figure things out. But a month later, I saw him and Caroline sitting together in a cafe near campus, laughing over shared pastries. They weren't kissing, but their body language was enough. It was the kind of closeness people don't accidentally fall into. When I confronted her that time, she shrugged and told me I was being dramatic. "It's not my fault guys like talking to me," she said, flipping her hair over her shoulder. I remember standing there feeling small, feeling stupid, feeling like I didn't have the right to be upset because she made it sound like I was blaming her for breathing. And maybe that was the moment something changed inside me. Maybe that was when a door quietly closed and I started carrying my suspicion like an overstuffed suitcase, dragging it from one Christmas to the next without ever unpacking it. Parents don't help in situations like these. Every time I brought it up, they dismissed it. Mom would say, "She's just trying to be nice," while Dad mumbled something about sibling rivalry being normal. No one wanted to acknowledge the actual problem, that Caroline had a way of stepping into any dynamic and tipping it just far enough that I was no longer the center of anything. So instead of calling it what it was, I learned to shrink myself in subtle ways. I stopped bringing home boys I really liked. I told my friends not to talk to her too much, terrified they'd choose her over me. And worst of all, I began to believe that maybe I was the problem, that maybe I simply wasn't enough to keep anyone's attention without her threatening to take it. This Christmas, though, felt heavier from the start. Not because I expected catastrophe, but because I finally understood the patterns. I understood the tiny flinches, the sharp smiles, the way her eyes scanned Ryan like she was trying to read him before I had the chance. As I watched her interact with him this year, the memories pressed against me like old bruises. Each one a reminder that I'd lived this story before, too many times in too many forms, and I was tired of pretending it never happened. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet question kept resurfacing, whispering through the holiday warmth. How many more Christmases would I sacrifice before something finally changed? There's a strange kind of déjà vu that happens when you've lived the same pain so many times it becomes seasonal. For some people, Christmas means hot cocoa, midnight movies, matching pajamas. For me, it meant preparing myself, mentally, emotionally, almost physically, for the moment Caroline would turn the holiday warmth into a stage and my relationships into props. As Ryan and I unpacked our bags in my old bedroom, I felt that familiar heaviness settle over me. The room looked exactly like I left it. Pale blue walls, a bookshelf leaning slightly to the left, childhood photos tucked into frames I never bothered to replace. Everything felt frozen in time except me. Each year I walked in older, more guarded, more aware of the way the past shaped the present. Ryan tossed his overnight bag onto the bed and stretched. The sound of the mattress springs squeaked softly, reminding me of late-night talks and teenage tears I'd once spilled here. He gave me a warm smile, but his eyes narrowed ever so slightly with concern. "What's wrong?" he asked. I shrugged it off. "Just tired from the drive," I said, though the truth pressed against my ribcage like a secret threatening to climb out. I didn't want to start Christmas by telling him he was walking into a pattern I'd never fully escaped. Not yet. A faint shout of laughter drifted up from downstairs. Caroline's. Even her voice sounded rehearsed, perfectly pitched to draw attention. My chest tightened instinctively. I could almost picture her now, telling some story with grand gestures, making sure she stayed at the center of every conversation. Ryan heard it too. "She seems fun," he said casually. That single sentence hit harder than I expected. Not because he meant anything by it, but because I'd heard it before, from every guy I'd ever brought home. Every one of them started out thinking Caroline was fun. And every time, I watched that harmless word slowly morph into something that chipped away at me. Fascination, attraction, curiosity. I sat on the edge of the bed, picking at a loose thread on my sweater. "She is, sometimes," I said. It was the safest answer I could give. Ryan moved closer and gently bumped his shoulder against mine. "You good?" he asked again, softer this time. I nodded, though my stomach twisted. I didn't want to taint his first night here with my anxiety. I wanted to believe that maybe this year would be different. But belief doesn't erase history. It only distracts from it. When we went back downstairs, the living room was buzzing. Christmas music played softly, lights blinked steadily on the tree, and the fireplace crackled with a familiar rhythm. My dad was pouring himself a drink. My mom was fussing over a bowl of sugared pecans, and Caroline, of course, was sitting in the center of the couch like the unofficial hostess of the entire holiday. She lit up the second Ryan appeared. Finally, we were about to send a search party, she teased, brushing her hair back with a practiced swipe. Her gaze skimmed over him like she was cataloging every detail. The way he walked, the way he smiled, the way he carried himself. Ryan laughed politely, and I felt a small, uncomfortable pang in my chest. Then she patted the spot next to her. Not just any spot, the spot closest to the fireplace, the warmest place in the room, the seat she always sat in. Come sit, she said. You've got to be freezing after that long drive. Ryan looked at me for a second, and I nodded as casually as I could. He sat down. She didn't move over to make space. He ended up closer to her than I liked. I took the armchair across from them. Not because I wanted to, but because the seating arrangement had already been decided without me. It always was. The conversation rolled on, mostly small talk at first. Dad asked Ryan about sports, Mom asked about holiday traditions, and Caroline wove herself into everything like a thread that refused to be pulled out. The way she watched Ryan wasn't subtle. Her eyes lingered too long. Her smiles curved just a bit too wide. Her questions carried a tone that made my shoulders clench. She kept making little jokes about how Ryan must be brave to date someone as opinionated as me, or how he seemed like the type who could handle attention, all while drawing that attention toward herself. Each little moment was tiny enough to ignore, but together they formed a familiar pattern, a holiday mosaic of microaggressions and subtle flirtation. At one point, Mom asked Ryan if he wanted more cider, and before he could answer, Caroline leapt up. I'll get it, she said, already halfway to the kitchen. She came back with a mug topped with cinnamon and whipped cream, fancier than anything she made for the rest of us. Ryan accepted it politely. I stared at the swirl of whipped cream and felt something cold settle into my ribs. The worst part was how comfortable she was, like she had rehearsed this dance for years, slipping into it effortlessly, confident that she knew every step. I'd seen it so many times. Step 1. Charm step 2. Flirt step 3. Undermine step 4. Pretend innocence. Watching it unfold again was like watching a movie I already knew the ending to, but hoping, desperately, that maybe this time the plot would change. Eventually, Ryan excused himself to take a phone call, leaving me and Caroline alone in the living room. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she adjusted her sweater, smoothed her hair, and smiled at her reflection in the ornament on the tree. Then, without looking at me, she said, "You really picked a good one this time." There was something in her tone, something light but sharp enough to sting. And in that moment, I felt the familiar dread settle deeper. This Christmas wasn't starting differently at all. It was starting exactly the same. Family holidays are supposed to be warm and inclusive, right? Laughter, shared stories, clinking dishes. Those little rhythms that make you feel like you belong. But in my family, there's a certain pattern I've learned to recognize. When something uncomfortable happens, everyone looks the other way, smiles politely, and pretends it's not happening. And with Caroline involved, that pattern has always been painfully consistent. By the second evening of our Christmas visit, I was painfully aware of it. Caroline had already managed to dominate most of the conversations, her energy radiating toward Ryan in a way that made my chest ache. Whenever I tried to interject, to tell a story or share a laugh, she'd somehow redirect the attention, adding just enough charm and wit to make me seem, by comparison, small or anxious. The cruelest part? The rest of the family seemed oblivious, or worse, they were complicit in their silence. Mom never said a word. She hovered nearby with a plate of cookies or a towel in hand, nodding approvingly at Caroline whenever she laughed, complimented Ryan, or made some clever remark. Not once did she glance at me with a questioning look or ask if I was okay. Dad, as usual, drifted through the chaos like a polite ghost, raising his eyebrows when Caroline winked at Ryan, and muttering something about sibling rivalry that sounded dismissive even to him. It was always easier for them to call it normal than to acknowledge that Caroline was crossing lines. My cousins and aunts added to the illusion, too. When Caroline made a joke that belittled me slightly, or exaggerated a story to make herself look smarter or funnier, they laughed. I caught a few glances from my younger cousin, Emily, who looked embarrassed on my behalf. But no one else spoke up. Even Ryan seemed hesitant to challenge the dynamic, maybe because he didn't want to ruin the fragile harmony of a holiday gathering. Caroline thrived in this environment. It was like the family's blind spots were her playground. She could flirt with Ryan, tease me, and take center stage without ever receiving a rebuke. In her eyes, this inaction wasn't indifference, it was permission. She would give me a sly smile at moments she thought I noticed, letting me feel both rage and helplessness at once. During dinner, the pattern was painfully obvious. Caroline maneuvered herself so she could sit closest to Ryan, leaning in when he told a story, laughing just a little louder than the rest of us. Mom praised her charm, saying, "Caroline really knows how to make someone feel welcome." Dad nodded, oblivious or unwilling to speak up. I sat quietly at my spot, fork hovering over my plate, tasting a mixture of food and frustration. The warmth of the meal and the fire in the hearth felt like a cruel contrast to the cold pit in my stomach. The worst part was how strategic she was about it. It wasn't random attention-seeking. It was deliberate. She had learned exactly how far to go, what to say, and when to pause just long enough to make me doubt myself. Her charm was a weapon, and our family's passive approval or avoidance was her shield. There were small, funny moments, too, of course. She made Ryan laugh at a poorly timed joke I had tried to tell, and he looked toward me apologetically, shaking his head. I could feel my cheeks heating up. Even though I wanted to find humor in it, even giggle quietly to myself, the sting lingered. It wasn't just about losing attention. It was about watching someone I cared about be subtly pulled away by someone I loved and trusted. I caught myself replaying old memories, the ones that had taught me this pattern. The Christmas I was 13, my first crush visited, and Caroline flirted with him right in front of me. The summer cookout when my boyfriend laughed at one of her funny stories and ignored mine entirely. Mom had called me dramatic. Dad had called it a phase. And every time, Caroline had learned just how far she could push before anyone intervened. That night, when Ryan excused himself to make a call, Caroline leaned toward me with a deceptively sweet smile. "Don't worry," she said softly, eyes glinting in the Christmas lights. "Everyone loves me. It's okay if he notices a little." It was meant to sound innocent, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that reminded me how alone I often felt in the middle of my own family. It wasn't just her. It was the family's failure to act, their consistent inattention to the subtle betrayals that stacked year after year. They were like accomplices without realizing it, leaving me to navigate the storm myself. I sipped my cocoa, letting the warmth spread through my hands and into my chest. Calmed me for a moment, but only just. I knew that if I wanted to survive this holiday without breaking down, I had to keep my focus, my humor, and my composure intact. And I also knew that no one else would notice if Caroline crossed the line, except me. So I watched, quietly, carefully, not from a place of paranoia, but from necessity. Because in a house full of people pretending not to notice, the only one who could see the truth was me. And in that silence, I realized something important. This Christmas, like every other before it, would test me, and maybe for the first time, I was ready to pay attention in a way I hadn't before. The next morning started innocently enough. Snowflakes clung to the window pane, dusting the yard in that delicate, unreal white that makes everything look calm and magical. I had brewed a cup of coffee, hoping the warmth would settle my nerves and give me some sense of normalcy before the chaos of the day began. But as soon as I stepped into the living room, I felt it. The first real twinge of unease that told me this Christmas might spiral faster than I was ready for. Caroline was already there, curled on the couch with Ryan beside her. Her posture was casual, relaxed, but there was something deliberate in the way she leaned toward him, her knee brushing the edge of his leg just slightly. He shifted unconsciously, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth, but I could see the tension too. It wasn't overt, not yet, but the subtle physical closeness set off a knot in my stomach. I told myself it was harmless. Maybe she was just cold, maybe she liked the warmth of the fire. But then she laughed at something he said. A laugh a little too high-pitched, a little too soft, like she was trying to make him lean in closer. My heart sank. The first time I confronted this kind of behavior in my life, I had no vocabulary for it. I had only known the pit of embarrassment, the sting of being upstaged, the quiet humiliation of watching attention slip away from me. And now, even years later, I felt the same mixture of helplessness and anger that had haunted me since my first boyfriend, Caleb, so many Christmases ago. I took a slow breath, deciding to stay calm. I poured myself a cup of cocoa, letting the warm chocolate smell rise into my nose, and moved to sit in the armchair across from them. Caroline's eyes flicked to me, but only for a brief moment, and she smiled. Just enough to feel innocent, just enough to make me second-guess my suspicions. The subtle power play was classic Caroline. As Ryan sipped his coffee, she launched into a story about their high school friends, one that didn't make sense at first but clearly had been tweaked to make me look slightly oblivious. I forced a chuckle. I always did, because any visible discomfort only encouraged her. And I could see the small spark of pride in her eyes as she noticed my forced reaction. It wasn't just the words. It was the gestures, the tone, the timing. She leaned in slightly whenever Ryan laughed, her hair falling in front of her face in a way that made him have to move his head to see her eyes. Her hand brushed against his arm just long enough to register, and I could feel the sting of recognition. This wasn't innocent. It was practiced, deliberate, designed. I watched them, my mind ticking over every interaction I'd witnessed over the years. Each micro-flinch, each glance, each innocent touch now fell into a pattern I couldn't ignore. I realized this was no longer about teenage rivalry or harmless teasing. Caroline had escalated her game, and this time, Ryan was the target. By mid-morning, breakfast was on the table. The smell of sizzling bacon and pancakes filled the kitchen, but it was impossible to enjoy the food. Every time I tried to engage Ryan in conversation about work or plans for the day, Caroline interrupted with a question or a quip, drawing his attention like a magnet. She was careful not to overdo it, just enough to make me feel small without being obvious. The subtlety made it sting even more. Later, while I cleared some plates, I caught a glimpse of Ryan glancing at me nervously. He was trying, I could tell. But every time he leaned toward me, Caroline would laugh softly, leaning in herself, ensuring she remained the center of his attention. The closeness, the smiles, the warmth she exuded. It was intoxicating to anyone who didn't know the history, and painfully familiar to me. Even my parents failed to notice or refused to. Mom complimented Caroline on her sweetness and hospitality, completely unaware that the line between charm and flirtation had already been crossed. Dad hummed approvingly at her stories, oblivious to the micro-betrayals unfolding in front of him. Everyone treated it as harmless, as if I were overreacting. I had learned that this pattern was normal in my family, but normal didn't make it less painful. By late morning, I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. Every instinct screamed that this wasn't just Caroline being herself. This was her intentionally encroaching, subtly undermining me, and placing herself at the center of attention. I wanted to call it out, to draw a line, but years of watching this pattern told me that confrontation would only feed her satisfaction. Instead, I sat quietly, my hands wrapped around my mug, feeling the heat seep into my palms. I observed her, cataloged her gestures, memorized the little ways she tried to assert dominance. The tension in my chest was heavy, but it was tempered by a new determination. I wouldn't ignore it this time. I would watch, I would learn, and I would wait for the right moment. And as Caroline laughed softly at something Ryan said, leaning ever so slightly closer, I felt it settle. This Christmas, the first real signs were unmistakable. She was escalating, and I was fully aware for the first time that ignoring it wasn't an option. By midday, the holiday had fully kicked into motion, with laughter echoing through the house, Christmas music humming softly in the background, and the faint smell of baked ham mingling with pine needles. On the surface, it looked like the perfect holiday scene. But for me, every laugh, every word, every glance was another test of patience. Caroline had already settled into her role as the unspoken star of the day, and Ryan was still polite, still trying to navigate the minefield I knew all too well. The first instance of real undermining came during lunch. I attempted to tell a story about a disastrous shopping trip with my mom, something I thought would be funny and light. Caroline, of course, jumped in mid-sentence, waving her hand as if to say, "Hold on, I've got this." She retold my story, embellishing a few details, inserting herself as the clever heroine who saved the day, and made me look foolish by comparison. Everyone laughed, including Ryan, though I could see the slight hesitation in his eyes, the polite sort of laugh that indicates someone is trying not to offend. I forced a laugh too, feeling the familiar prickling in my chest. It was funny in a cruel way, the way you can laugh at a joke when the punchline is at your own expense. I noticed Caroline's small smirk as she watched me, savoring the effect she had, even without saying a word directly to hurt me. The subtlety of it made it worse. She didn't have to be cruel. She just had to nudge the narrative until it tilted in her favor. Later, we moved into the family room to exchange small gifts, and the dynamic continued. Whenever Ryan tried to make eye contact with me, Caroline laughed at something minor. A word, a gesture, a facial expression, and he'd instinctively glance at her, a small frown forming in the corners of his mouth. It wasn't flirtation he wanted, not really. It was confusion, a momentary lapse caused by Caroline's charm, and still my parents seemed oblivious. She wasn't just charming. She was strategic. She timed her jokes, her laughs, and even her casual touches to maximize the emotional disruption. It wasn't physical overstepping yet, but it was psychological, and I felt the shift immediately. Every time I tried to speak, she either interrupted with a better joke or redirected the attention to Ryan in a way that left me standing there awkwardly, my own words fading into background noise. There were moments that were almost funny, if I didn't feel the burn of them. She told a story about the year we got matching holiday pajamas as kids, exaggerating my embarrassment and making herself the hero who consoled me when I protested. Ryan laughed, and I laughed, but inside, I was measuring each subtle nudge, each sly glance, each tiny triumph that Caroline seemed to collect like trophies. I caught myself scanning the room for allies, but the truth was, my family had conditioned themselves not to intervene. Mom complimented Caroline for being so cheerful and welcoming. Dad nodded absently, sipping his cider, murmuring, "It's just how she is. Don't let it get to you." And even Ryan, as careful and kind as he was, seemed unsure how to respond without escalating tension. Caroline thrived on that ambiguity. She was a predator in holiday disguise. It wasn't just conversation. During a quick game of charades that afternoon, Caroline positioned herself strategically so that every time Ryan was about to guess a clue, she leaned forward, whispering a hint or making a joke. He would glance at me, caught in the crossfire of kindness and confusion, and I could see the small anxiety in his posture. It was subtle, but it was effective. By the end of the game, I felt diminished, as if my role in this household, my own home, my own family, had been quietly minimized by her performance. Even the physical cues mattered. A hand brushing an arm, a leaning posture that just grazed him, a touch on the shoulder meant to feel accidental but clearly intentional. I felt each one in my chest like a small electric shock. She was testing boundaries, exploring how far she could go before anyone noticed, and because everyone else was either distracted or dismissive, she could operate in this space freely, like a spider spinning a web I didn't even realize I was walking into. By late afternoon, I realized that humor had become her weapon. Each laugh, each joke, each sly smile wasn't just entertainment. It was a calculated method of asserting dominance over the room, over Ryan, and over me. I had spent years dismissing these moments as just Caroline being friendly. But now, With my adult understanding and with Ryan involved, the pattern was unmistakable. And yet, despite my rising irritation, I forced myself to breathe slowly, to remain composed. I knew from years of experience that losing my temper or reacting visibly would only fuel her, make her giddy with satisfaction, and give the family yet another reason to dismiss my feelings. I sat back, keeping my hands folded in my lap, and cataloged everything. The laughter, the subtle gestures, the timing. Because this year I wasn't going to be blind. Not anymore. By evening, as the fire crackled softly and the house grew quieter, I found myself alone for a moment, sipping cocoa and reflecting. Caroline's laughter still floated down the hall, bright and precise, like she knew exactly how much of me she could claim without anyone stopping her. I felt anger, embarrassment, and a tiny spark of determination all at once. This Christmas, I realized, wasn't just another repetition of old patterns. It was the beginning of a test, and for the first time, I wasn't planning to fail silently. By the evening of the second day, the playful tension had shifted into something heavier. Caroline's behavior had escalated in a way that no longer felt casual or innocent. Every glance, every laugh, every touch now carried a weight that made my stomach knot. This wasn't just holiday charm. It was deliberate, targeted, and exhausting. Ryan had been polite, accommodating, and patient throughout the day. He asked questions, smiled at stories, and even tried to include me in conversations. But Caroline had a way of nudging him toward her, subtly, just enough that he'd tilt his attention her way without realizing it. I watched it happen, trying to tell myself it was harmless, but the pattern was unmistakable. The betrayals of the past, the laughter that favored her, the stories retold to make me look foolish, were alive again in real time, and I felt trapped in the old, familiar loop. The first truly personal betrayal came over dessert. We were in the dining room, the faint aroma of cinnamon from my mom's apple pie filling the air, when Caroline leaned toward Ryan to whisper something. An aside, a joke, a compliment, I wasn't entirely sure. I could see his eyes shift toward her, his smile warming, and my chest tightened. It wasn't just that she was charming him. It was that I felt powerless to stop it. The closeness, the subtle attention, it all had a precision that was almost surgical. I forced myself to stay seated, hands clasped around my fork. I reminded myself not to react too quickly. Years of experience had taught me that calling her out immediately only made her grin, as if the world were a stage and I was an easily rattled prop. Instead, I observed, mentally cataloging every motion, every inflection, every carefully calculated gesture she made. Caroline's tactics weren't just social, they were psychological. She leaned in when he spoke, brushing the tiniest part of her sleeve against his arm, and adjusted her tone so that her laugh seemed exclusively meant for him. She mirrored his movements almost instinctively, tilting her head the same way he did, matching his posture. It was as if she had studied him beforehand, learning the rhythm that would draw his attention without ever overtly being forward. I felt a familiar sting of anger and disbelief. Why did no one else notice? Mom praised Caroline for her charm, saying, "She's so thoughtful and welcoming." Dad made a vague joke about her being the life of the party. Everyone seemed blind to the subtle betrayals unfolding right in front of them. It was as if my discomfort didn't exist, or worse, didn't matter. The most frustrating part was Ryan himself. He seemed genuinely unaware, polite, and careful not to offend, but his polite responses only gave Caroline more room to maneuver. He leaned toward her when she spoke, just a fraction more than necessary, and I could see the confusion in his eyes. He wanted to include me, but her deliberate positioning made it increasingly difficult. I felt a mix of frustration, hurt, and anger coursing through me. It wasn't just that she had crossed a boundary, again. It was that she had done so with precision and with the implicit consent of everyone around us. The betrayal was deeply personal because it involved Ryan, someone I cared about and trusted, someone whose attention I thought was mine to share. And Caroline had already claimed a piece of it before I had the chance to respond. Later that evening, when we were watching an old Christmas movie by the fireplace, the tension was palpable. Caroline scooted just a little closer to Ryan, letting her hand rest lightly on the back of the couch behind him. It wasn't a bold move, but it was intentional, and it spoke volumes. I could see him glance at me, torn between discomfort and social etiquette, unsure of how to react. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, the familiar knot in my stomach, the quiet rage that had accumulated over years of repeated patterns. At that moment, I realized something crucial. Caroline wasn't just undermining me socially. She was actively testing boundaries. She was gauging how far she could push before anyone noticed, before I finally spoke up, before Ryan recognized the subtle manipulation. And the fact that she had done this to me countless times before only made it worse. It wasn't new. It was a repetition, a rehearsed performance that I was now painfully aware of. I sank back into the armchair opposite them, wrapping my hands around my cocoa. I allowed myself to feel the weight of the betrayal fully, acknowledging the hurt, the anger, and the frustration. The quiet hum of the movie, the flicker of the firelight, the soft crackle of the logs. It all contrasted sharply with the storm that had quietly settled in my chest. Caroline was smiling, completely unaware, or perhaps intentionally aware, of the effect she had on me. This wasn't just holiday mischief anymore. It was personal. And I knew, deep in my gut, that I couldn't let it continue unchecked. Not this year, not ever again. That'd be why the third day of Christmas, the tension had reached a different level. Caroline's behavior wasn't subtle anymore, and every interaction with Ryan seemed to carry a hidden edge. I could feel the adrenaline coiling in my chest, the same sensation I'd felt years ago when my first serious boyfriend had fallen under her influence. But this time I was older, more aware, and determined not to lose control. It started during the morning gift exchange. Ryan unwrapped a small gadget I had picked out for him, and Caroline leaned over, exclaiming with exaggerated delight. Her hand brushed his shoulder just long enough to make it noticeable, and he smiled awkwardly, caught between politeness and discomfort. I forced a smile, pretending not to see, but my jaw ached from clenching. It was the first moment I truly understood how skilled she had become at operating without drawing obvious attention. Later, during a casual walk outside in the snow, Caroline somehow found herself side by side with Ryan. She talked, laughed, and nudged his arm lightly when she made a joke. I followed a few steps behind, crunching snow under my boots, feeling the cold air on my face, but warmer than I wanted it to feel from the rising irritation inside me. Ryan glanced back briefly, and I could see the unease in his eyes, like he was aware of the tension but unsure how to handle it without causing a scene. By mid-morning, I realized she was testing limits. Each small gesture, leaning in, brushing an arm, tilting her head, was deliberate. It was a silent challenge. How far could she go before I reacted? How far could she push before anyone else noticed the subtle shift in dynamics? And the frightening part was that no one seemed to notice or care, that I was being undermined. The first close call happened over lunch. Caroline asked Ryan a question about his plans for New Year's, leaning forward with that casual charm I knew too well. He smiled and responded, and I moved to join the conversation, thinking I could redirect it. But as soon as I spoke, she interrupted, slightly louder, slightly more animated. Ryan's attention shifted almost imperceptibly, and I felt that familiar twist of frustration deep in my gut. It wasn't dramatic enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it. Every subtle glance, every gentle tilt of the body, every micro-expression. It all registered like a warning siren. Later in the afternoon, during a quiet moment near the fireplace, I noticed Ryan laughing at a comment she made. It wasn't a loud laugh, just the soft, polite kind, but his eyes lingered on her for a beat longer than they should have. My chest tightened as I realized just how practiced she had become at manipulating attention. It wasn't overt, but it was precise, calibrated to get the maximum effect without crossing a visible line. And the family's obliviousness made it all the more infuriating. I had a close call myself when I considered confronting her directly. A surge of anger rose, telling me to point out her behavior and set boundaries. But I knew from experience that confrontation without planning would play right into her hands. It would make me appear overreactive, and everyone else would dismiss me as dramatic. So I swallowed the words, letting them simmer instead of letting them spill. That evening, while Ryan stepped away to take a phone call, Caroline leaned in to whisper something in my ear. Her voice was soft, intimate, almost conspiratorial. "Don't take it personally," she said, a sly smile tugging at her lips. "It's just how things go around here." I felt the weight of her words, the unspoken threat lurking behind the polite tone. She knew exactly how to push me, exactly how to unsettle me, and exactly how to make it seem like I was imagining everything. The small gestures continued throughout dinner. Every time Ryan leaned forward to respond to me, Caroline interjected with a comment or question that drew him back to her. The subtle closeness of her body, the gentle touches, the light laughter, it all blended into a slow, steady erosion of my sense of security. I realized that this wasn't just a one-time occurrence. It was a sustained campaign, and I was the target. Even as the family laughed, shared stories, and passed around plates of food, I felt the tension like a tight coil in my chest. I watched Caroline's movements, cataloged her interactions, and noted every micro-reaction from Ryan. The situation was escalating, and I was hyper-aware of every moment, every gesture, every tiny breach of social etiquette. By bedtime, I sat alone for a few minutes, sipping cocoa and letting the quiet snow outside calm my thoughts. The house was warm, cozy, and seemingly peaceful, but I felt on edge like a wire stretched too tightly. I knew Caroline was skilled, deliberate, and cunning, and I also knew that if I wasn't careful, she could completely manipulate this holiday, Ryan's attention, and the family dynamics without anyone realizing what had truly happened. The close calls of the day left me exhausted but focused. Every small maneuver she made, every glance, every laugh, every subtle touch, it all fed a growing awareness inside me. I was no longer just observing. I was preparing. And the storm she had quietly unleashed was only beginning. By the fourth day of our Christmas visit, it felt like the house itself was conspiring against me. Every familiar corner, every scent of pine and cinnamon, every warm glow of the lights became a reminder of the invisible trap Caroline had set. Even the soft crackle of the fireplace seemed to underscore her subtle triumphs. Each small victory she claimed over my boyfriend, over me, over the holiday itself. The morning started quietly, but I could feel Caroline's presence like a shadow that moved ahead of her. She entered the kitchen with a deliberately breezy step, hair perfectly arranged, coffee mug in hand. Ryan followed her unconsciously, drawn to her laughter and light energy, the way she leaned in to catch his words. I took a seat at the far end of the table, hands wrapped around my cocoa, feeling the familiar tight knot in my stomach. Caroline's ability to dominate attention without anyone noticing was infuriating. She didn't need to speak loudly. She didn't need to make a scene. A tilt of her head, a soft laugh, a subtle brush of the shoulder. Each tiny gesture was enough to redirect focus, to make me feel like I didn't exist in the space where I should have felt safest. It was psychological manipulation, performed in plain sight, and everyone except me was either oblivious or unwilling to acknowledge it. Even Ryan, kind and considerate as he was, struggled to navigate the tension. He attempted to include me in conversation, asking about my plans for New Year's, my work, and even small stories about past holidays. But as soon as he leaned in, Caroline would tilt her head, laugh softly, or make a small comment that drew his attention back to her. I could see his hesitation, the subtle flinch when he realized he was being subtly pulled away. And I felt the sting in my chest that comes from helplessly watching someone you care about being swayed by another's deliberate influence. By mid-morning, the tension had begun to affect the entire household dynamic. Mom fussed over breakfast, remarking repeatedly on how sweet and charming Caroline was, completely missing the way she had monopolized Ryan's attention. Dad made a passing joke about sibling rivalry, entirely missing the undertones, and even my younger cousins seemed to glance my way with sympathetic but silent looks. It felt as if I were navigating a minefield while everyone else walked freely, blindfolded. Caroline wasn't overtly cruel, but her subtle dominance was exhausting. She laughed at the right moments, added slightly exaggerated stories to make herself seem more interesting, and positioned herself physically in a way that blocked my access to Ryan. Every micro-gesture was calculated to destabilize me just enough that I felt the strain but couldn't call her out without appearing dramatic. Her brilliance was infuriating. By the afternoon, I noticed a pattern emerging in her movements. She would tilt her body slightly when Ryan spoke, always ensuring he was drawn in visually. She would echo his tones subtly when he made a comment, matching his rhythm and creating a quiet, almost hypnotic rapport. Even without words, she was claiming his attention, and every time I tried to speak up or redirect the conversation, she managed to regain it with barely a gesture. I felt the walls closing in metaphorically, but almost physically, too. Every corner of the house reminded me of past Christmases, past betrayals, past moments where Caroline had subtly undermined me. The familiar smells of the kitchen, the warm glow of the tree lights, even the soft music in the background. All of it seemed to echo the patterns I had lived with for years. This wasn't new, yet it was devastating to experience again. Fully aware this time, I retreated briefly to my room to collect myself. The blue walls, the bookshelf, the old photographs. They offered a small sense of sanctuary, a place where I could observe without immediate confrontation. I replayed Caroline's gestures, her laughter, her precise timing, and cataloged every subtle manipulation. The closer I watched, the more obvious it became. She wasn't just being playful or charming. She was systematically testing boundaries, exploring how far she could go without anyone noticing, and with Ryan as the focal point. By the evening, the subtle games escalated further. While I tried to engage in casual conversation with Ryan, Caroline inserted herself into nearly every interaction, laughing at his jokes before I could respond, leaning in slightly when he spoke, tilting her head to catch his eyes. Each time, I felt the tight coil in my chest grow stronger, a mixture of frustration, anger, and helplessness. I realized, finally, that Caroline had turned the house into her stage. Every room, every corner, every social interaction became a calculated scene in her ongoing performance. And in this quiet tension, I made a mental note. I would no longer allow this pattern to dominate the holiday. I didn't yet know how or when I would act, but the awareness itself was a small victory, a spark of control in an otherwise suffocating environment. By the time the day ended and the lights were dimmed, I felt drained but focused. Caroline had won some battles, but the war was still unfolding. And I knew that if I wanted this Christmas to end differently, I would have to watch closely, plan carefully, and wait for the perfect moment to reclaim what was mine. By the fifth day, the tension in the house had reached a boiling point, though on the surface, everything seemed festive and calm. The tree lights twinkled softly, the smell of freshly baked cookies lingered in the air, and holiday music played quietly in the background. But beneath the calm, every movement, every glance, every laugh had taken on a sharp edge. Caroline's subtle maneuvers had escalated to a point where I could no longer ignore them, and the quiet battle between us was palpable. Ryan was still trying to be polite, still trying to maintain a balance, but I could see the strain in his posture. Every time he smiled at Caroline or laughed at her jokes, there was a slight hesitation, a flicker of guilt or confusion. It wasn't his fault. He was inexperienced in this kind of subtle manipulation, but that didn't make the sting any less real. I felt the familiar tightness in my chest, a knot that had grown over years of watching Caroline charm and undermine, now flaring up again. The first intense moment came during the family brunch. Caroline had positioned herself next to Ryan, laughing softly at a comment he made about his work. She leaned in just enough to catch his eyes, tilting her head and brushing a strand of hair from her face in a casual gesture that was anything but casual. Mom, as always, seemed oblivious, commenting instead on how cheerful and polite Caroline was, as if completely unaware of the silent game unfolding in front of her. Dad nodded absently, focused on his coffee, providing no intervention. I tried to engage Ryan in conversation, asking about his latest project at work. Before he could respond fully, Caroline interjected with a similar question, phrasing it in a way that subtly suggested I hadn't been paying attention to his accomplishments. He laughed, a polite, nervous chuckle, and glanced at me as if to apologize. But there was no way to respond without escalating the situation. I felt frustration, humiliation, and an odd kind of rage simmering inside me. Later, during a walk outside, Caroline found ways to encroach further. Every time Ryan took a step forward to respond to me, she leaned slightly toward him, laughing at some minor observation or story, a soft brush of her arm grazing his without seeming intentional. He glanced at me, clearly aware of the situation, but his politeness kept him from reacting. It was infuriating, watching someone you cared about being subtly swayed while being unable to intervene without creating a scene. By the afternoon, my awareness had sharpened. I cataloged every micro-movement, every glance, every pause, every laugh. Caroline wasn't acting randomly. She was calculating, measuring, testing boundaries. Her behavior wasn't cruel in a traditional sense. No shouting, no overt insult. But it was precise. A psychological dance designed to unsettle me and gradually pull Ryan's attention toward her. I felt the weight of it pressing down, knowing this wasn't just playful mischief. The family, as always, remained oblivious. Mom complimented Caroline's warmth, Dad muttered about sibling rivalry, and the younger cousins were either quiet or supportive in subtle ways. No one recognized the slow erosion of my confidence, the subtle manipulation unfolding in plain sight. It was exhausting, infuriating, and deeply personal. Caroline escalated further during a board game later that afternoon. She positioned herself next to Ryan, leaning in to explain rules he already understood, laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny, and gently brushing her hand against his. I felt my jaw clench, my fingers tightening around the game piece in my hand, trying to maintain composure. Every laugh, every gesture, every subtle flirtation was another reminder of how precise and practiced she had become. I realized then that the day was no longer just about Christmas. It was a silent battlefield. Caroline was testing me, testing Ryan, and testing the boundaries of the family's attention. I felt trapped in my own house, observing, cataloging, and measuring, knowing that any visible reaction would feed her sense of control. Yet doing nothing also felt unbearable, like standing still while being slowly undermined. By the evening, the tension had transformed into a quiet, simmering anger. I retreated briefly to my room to collect myself, feeling the adrenaline and frustration coursing through my body. The Christmas lights reflected softly against the window pane, the snow outside casting long shadows across the floor, and for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. I knew the battle wasn't over. I also knew that the tipping point was near. Caroline had pushed too far, and the subtle manipulations were no longer small. They were deliberate assaults on my confidence and my relationship. Something had to change, and I began to realize that only I could change it. The rest of the family wouldn't, and Ryan alone couldn't. The silent battle had reached its peak, and it was time to start planning the response. The morning of the 6th day started with an uneasy quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every creak of the floorboards, every tick of the clock, every subtle shift in the room. Caroline was already up, humming softly as she rearranged decorations on the mantel, her movements graceful and purposeful. Ryan was in the kitchen, making coffee, seemingly oblivious to the tension that had wrapped itself around the house like a second layer of walls. I stayed in my room a little longer than usual, sipping my cocoa, trying to steady my nerves. The events of the past days had left me tense, on edge, and wary. But there was something different this morning, a subtle shift I couldn't quite place. A faint glance, a half-smile from Caroline that felt off, calculated in a way that went beyond mere charm. I realized then that the truth I had been avoiding was staring me squarely in the face. The first undeniable sign came when Ryan mentioned something that Caroline had just told him about me. Details from conversations I thought were private, things I had shared only with close friends. I froze mid-sip, my heart pounding. Caroline had somehow extracted this information and presented it casually, as if to highlight my personal life, my preferences, my insecurities in front of him. The realization hit like a punch. Her interest in Ryan wasn't just flirtation. It was calculated, and she had been manipulating not only attention but information to her advantage. I watched her across the room, pretending to be absorbed in arranging ornaments. Every movement, every smile, every tilt of her head now made sense. She wasn't just charming or playful. She was strategic. She had studied patterns, rehearsed interactions, and used subtle psychology to influence Ryan without making it obvious to anyone else. This wasn't random. This was deliberate, premeditated. The weight of the truth made my chest tighten. All those years, all those previous Christmases weren't accidents. Caroline had been following the same pattern with every boyfriend I brought home, ensuring she was the center of attention, slowly undermining me, and manipulating those around me to her advantage. The memories of embarrassment, frustration, and quiet humiliation from my teenage years now aligned perfectly with the present moment, creating a painful clarity. Ryan, bless him, still seemed unaware of how deeply he had been drawn into her web. He tried to focus on me, asking about my work, my plans, my life, but Caroline had positioned herself subtly between us, her charm acting like a magnet. I could see the confusion in his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw, the hesitation in his tone. It was as if he sensed the tug of war but couldn't fully comprehend the cause. And I realized that part of me had underestimated Caroline's ability to manipulate not just social attention, but perception itself. The revelation hit hardest when I caught Caroline reviewing her phone, laughing softly at a text, her fingers brushing Ryan's arm. It wasn't overt, but it was intimate, deliberate, and deliberate again. The pieces clicked into place. Her rehearsed gestures, the way she consistently inserted herself between me and Ryan, the subtle collection of personal details, the timing of her laughter. Everything I had dismissed as harmless charm or coincidence was part of a clear strategy. To dominate, manipulate, and destabilize. The family still didn't notice. Mom complimented her warm personality. Dad made a vague joke about sibling rivalry, and even the younger cousins watched with tentative amusement. It was infuriating. Everyone's obliviousness wasn't just frustrating. It had been enabling this pattern for years. I realized that the solution would not come from them. It would have to come from me. I sat down in my room, letting the information settle, replaying interactions, cataloging gestures, and mentally constructing a timeline of her manipulations. Every small smile, every laugh, every casual touch, all of it now had purpose. And I finally understood the depth of the pattern. It wasn't random, it wasn't innocent, and it wasn't about fun. It was about control. A mix of anger, hurt, and clarity surged through me. The helplessness I had felt in previous holidays transformed into determination. I was no longer just observing. I was analyzing, planning, and preparing. The truth had been revealed, painfully and unmistakably, and now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. Caroline had underestimated me. She had assumed that my past compliance, my careful restraint, and my quiet endurance meant she could continue her pattern indefinitely. She was wrong. This time I had clarity, perspective, and a plan forming in my mind. The silent war of attention, manipulation, and influence was about to enter a new phase, and for the first time I felt in control. By the time the day drew to a close and the lights flickered softly across the living room, I allowed myself a quiet smile. Caroline was still there, still charming, still testing boundaries, unaware that I had finally seen the full picture. And in that moment, I understood something critical. Understanding her pattern was the first step toward reclaiming my space, my confidence, and my relationship. The truth had hit, but with it came power. A quiet, controlled, deliberate power that I hadn't felt in years. To be why the evening of the sixth day, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The tension of the past days had sharpened my awareness, and now, for the first time, I could see Caroline's patterns with absolute clarity. Every glance, every laugh, every casual brush of her hand had a purpose. She wasn't just charming. She was methodical, strategic, and confident in the chaos she created. I realized that she had been testing boundaries the entire holiday, measuring reactions from Ryan, from me, and even from the family. Her tactics weren't random. They were rehearsed, subtle, and precise. The soft laugh at the right moment, the gentle lean toward him, the perfectly timed joke. It was all designed to shift attention, destabilize me, and maintain her control without anyone overtly noticing. And for years, this pattern had repeated with every boyfriend I brought home, carefully hidden behind a mask of charm and innocence. The revelation didn't make my blood boil immediately. It was more like a sudden, piercing clarity that left me simultaneously furious and focused. I had been playing the wrong game for years, reacting emotionally, hoping the family would notice, hoping Ryan would see the subtle cues. But now I understood. Caroline thrived on inaction, on the silence of the people around her, on the assumption that her influence would go unchecked. The truth hit hard, but it also gave me a roadmap. I began cataloging everything. The way she had leaned toward Ryan at breakfast. How she had retold my stories during lunch, making herself the heroine while subtly undermining me. The casual touches, the micro-movements that drew him in just slightly more each time. All deliberate, all calculated. The next part of the revelation came when I noticed something I had missed before. Subtle alliances she had formed in the household. Mom, Dad, and a few cousins laughed at her jokes, praised her behavior, and unintentionally reinforced her pattern. It wasn't malice, it was obliviousness. And that meant the environment she relied on to manipulate attention and control perception was predictable. Everything she did was designed to exploit not just her charm but the family's inattentiveness. I realized then that the key wasn't confrontation, it was strategy. I didn't need to shout or call her out publicly. Instead, I could use the knowledge I now possessed, the pattern I had dissected, to subtly reclaim my space and regain Ryan's attention. Every moment Caroline thought she was in control, I could observe, record mentally, and plan my next move. The emotional weight of the realization was heavy. Anger, frustration, and hurt mingled with exhilaration. I felt empowered for the first time during a holiday dominated by Caroline's manipulations. The knowledge that her actions were deliberate gave me leverage. I didn't have to fight blindly anymore. I could play with precision just as she had. I also understood something important about Ryan. He was kind and polite, genuinely unaware of how deeply he had been drawn into Caroline's web. It wasn't his fault that he leaned toward her. It was the result of years of social conditioning, her skill and my family's inattention. But now, I could subtly redirect attention, gently guide interactions, and regain influence without making the situation obvious. I had the upper hand intellectually, emotionally, and strategically. The most surprising part of the revelation was how much calm it brought me. Instead of feeling cornered, I felt alert, prepared, and deliberate. Caroline's manipulations, which had previously left me feeling powerless, now provided the structure for my countermeasures. I could anticipate her moves, recognize her patterns, and act in ways that would gradually reclaim my authority in this space. By the time the night descended and the house quieted down, I had a plan forming. Nothing overt, nothing aggressive. Just subtle, intelligent steps that would allow me to regain confidence, draw Ryan's attention where it belonged, and restore the balance that Caroline had so carefully disrupted. I watched her across the room, smiling softly as she chatted with Ryan, completely unaware that I had seen everything. The truth had been revealed, and with it came a quiet power, a patient confidence that Caroline had never anticipated. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't just surviving Caroline's antics. I was preparing to turn the tide. The game had shifted, and by Christmas morning tomorrow, I knew the house would feel very different. The silent battle was about to change, and I was ready. Christmas morning arrived with a crisp clarity that felt almost symbolic. The snow outside sparkled in the early light, the air was sharp and cold, and the soft glow of the tree reflected across the living room. But this year I felt different. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting to Caroline's manipulations. I was in control, calm, and deliberate. I began the day with small, calculated gestures. Each smile, each comment, each question I asked Ryan was carefully timed to draw his attention subtly but unmistakably. I mirrored his movements, leaned slightly toward him during conversations, and laughed at his jokes in a way that was genuine but impossible to ignore. Caroline, ever observant, noticed the shift immediately, and I could see the flicker of surprise in her eyes. She realized, even if only subconsciously, that I was no longer a passive participant in her holiday game. The beauty of my quiet revenge was its subtlety. I didn't call her out, didn't accuse her of anything, didn't make a scene. Instead, I simply reclaimed space and attention through confidence, presence, and awareness. Every interaction with Ryan reinforced the bond one shared, highlighting the natural connection we had, while Caroline's manipulations slowly lost their effectiveness. She tried her usual gestures, leaning, laughing, whispering, but they no longer carried the same weight. Even the family began to notice, albeit indirectly. Mom commented on how warm and engaged I seemed this morning, and Dad remarked on the lively conversation between Ryan and me. Caroline's charm still sparkled, but it no longer overshadowed my presence. The dynamic had subtly shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it, even if they didn't know exactly why. By mid-morning, I implemented another quiet tactic. I introduced shared stories from our past, ones Ryan and I had laughed about together, giving him a sense of familiarity and intimacy that Caroline couldn't replicate. Each story drew him closer naturally, creating space where her influence had previously dominated. I could see her calculating, trying to adapt, but her moves were now reactionary, defensive, lacking the effortless precision she had wielded before. The small acts of control continued throughout the day. During games, meals, and casual conversations, I positioned myself strategically, matching her gestures only when necessary and otherwise focusing on reinforcing connection with Ryan. I didn't make her mistakes obvious. I didn't embarrass her. My aim was simply to restore balance. By maintaining calm and presence, I was gradually shifting the household energy back to one where I felt secure and confident. Caroline's frustration became evident in subtle ways. A flash of impatience here, a slightly tighter smile there, an unnecessary comment meant to reclaim attention. She was no longer in control, and it showed. The sense of superiority she had cultivated for days began to crack under the weight of my quiet, deliberate strategy. And I realized the beauty of revenge didn't need to be dramatic or confrontational. It could be intelligent, measured, and, most importantly, effective. Even Ryan noticed the change, though he couldn't pinpoint why. He leaned slightly closer during conversations, responded more genuinely to my jokes, and glanced at me with warmth rather than the nervous hesitation from earlier days. The subtle shift was mutual. His attention, once diverted and manipulated, now naturally returned to me, and I felt a deep satisfaction in seeing that the connection had not been lost. It had simply needed careful, patient restoration. By evening, the household energy had transformed. The warmth of shared laughter, the glow of holiday lights, and the scent of baked treats mingled with a newfound calm and balance. Caroline, for all her charm, was reduced to reaction, her usual dominance neutralized by my awareness and presence. I didn't need to shout, accuse, or create conflict. My quiet strategy had reclaimed what she had sought to control. Sitting near the fireplace later, sipping cocoa, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. The quiet revenge wasn't about humiliation. It was about balance, awareness, and self-respect. I had finally reclaimed the holiday, my space, and my confidence. Caroline could smile and charm as she wished, but this time, the stage was shared, and I was fully present, unshaken, and entirely aware. The satisfaction wasn't loud or dramatic. It was calm, controlled, and deeply rewarding. I had learned that true power often lay in subtlety, patience, and understanding rather than confrontation. And as the Christmas lights reflected softly in the window and the snow continued to fall outside, I realized that, finally, I had reclaimed my narrative and my peace, without ever needing to raise my voice. The final night of our holiday visit arrived quietly, the house bathed in the soft amber glow of Christmas lights. Outside, the snow settled in thick, silent blankets, muffling the world and giving the house a sense of isolation. For the first time this holiday, I felt a genuine calm. The tension that had plagued me since the first day had eased. Not because Caroline had stopped, but because I had finally taken control of my own experience. I sat by the fireplace, sipping cocoa, reflecting on the past week. Every glance, every laugh, every subtle gesture Caroline had made now felt clear in my mind. I realized that for years, I had allowed myself to feel powerless in her presence, letting her manipulations dictate not just the room, but my confidence, my interactions, and even the way I perceived myself. This time was different. I had watched, understood, and acted strategically. I hadn't humiliated her, I hadn't yelled or created a scene, but I had reclaimed my space, my relationships, and my peace of mind. It was striking how much control had come from observation. By simply paying attention, cataloging her patterns, and remaining calm, I had dismantled her influence without confrontation. Caroline's power had always depended on my reaction, on others' obliviousness, and on the subtle erosion of my presence. When I stopped feeding into the dynamics she relied on, her tactics no longer worked. It was an empowering lesson in self-awareness and the quiet strength of patience. I also reflected on Ryan's role in all of this. He had been kind, polite, and genuinely unaware of the subtle manipulations he had been drawn into. Watching him navigate the tension, I realized how important clarity and boundaries are in relationships. A strong connection can withstand distraction and manipulation when it is nurtured carefully, deliberately, and patiently. This Christmas had been a test, not just of my sister's cunning, but of my ability to protect what mattered without resorting to drama or conflict. Even Caroline's charm had taught me something valuable. Her intelligence, her ability to observe, and her subtle manipulations reminded me that people are often more strategic than we assume. But charm is not invincible. Awareness, composure, and deliberate action can neutralize even the most practiced tactics. It was a lesson in psychology, boundaries, and, most importantly, self-respect. I thought about my family and their obliviousness. Mom's praise, Dad's casual jokes, and the cousin's laughter had all contributed to her unchecked behavior. But I realized that I couldn't rely on them to intervene. True resolution comes from within, recognition of the problem, understanding of the dynamics, and deliberate steps to protect oneself. This understanding shifted my perspective. Power often lies not in confrontation, but in presence, strategy, and awareness. Looking forward, I knew future holidays would carry different stakes. I would still celebrate, still share traditions, and still welcome loved ones into my life. But I would do so armed with experience and awareness, prepared to navigate subtle challenges without losing composure or confidence. Caroline could continue to charm and influence, but I had discovered the tools to reclaim my narrative, to protect my relationships, and to remain grounded no matter the chaos she stirred. The quiet revenge of the past days had been deeply satisfying, but the most important victory was internal. I had proven to myself that I could act with intelligence, patience, and subtlety, even under intense emotional pressure. I had learned that self-respect and awareness are stronger than charm and manipulation. By observing, understanding, and acting deliberately, I had taken control of my experience and, in doing so, reclaimed a piece of myself that had long been diminished. As the night grew still, I reflected on the emotional arc of the holiday. The frustration, the subtle betrayals, the anxiety, the careful planning, and the quiet victories. It had been exhausting, infuriating, and ultimately deeply instructive. I realized that boundaries are not always enforced by others. They must be understood, protected, and claimed actively. And when done with patience, subtlety, and intelligence, the results are far more effective than anger or confrontation. Finally, as I looked out the window at the snow-covered yard, I felt a quiet sense of pride. I had navigated a familiar pattern of manipulation, confronted it internally, and emerged with control, dignity, and clarity. Caroline had been clever, but I had been smarter this time. This Christmas wasn't just a holiday. It was a lesson in observation, strategy, and self-respect. And with that knowledge, I knew that no charm, no subtle manipulation, and no sly smile could ever unsettle me in the same way again. If you've ever felt manipulated, undermined, or sidelined by someone close, you know how isolating it can feel. This story isn't just about a tricky sibling. It's about reclaiming your space, your confidence, and your voice. If this video resonated with you, hit like to show you've been through something similar. Leave a comment sharing your own experience or how you've handled someone who tried to control your life. It's amazing how many of us have been in these situations. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of betrayal, revenge, and personal triumph, told exactly the way they happened. Every story here reminds us that awareness, patience, and quiet strategy can be far more powerful than confrontation. Join the community and stay connected. You never know whose story might help you take control of your own life.